Unsurprisingly, I really like the Lord of the Rings movies. And while Fellowship of the Ring is arguably the best, my favorite will always be The Return of the King, as the highs in that movie are just so high that it always comes first for me. A big part of that was the conflict between Mordor and Gondor, and as such, that has had a huge impact on my hobbying over the years. From the very beginning, I had Mordor orcs and Gondor warriors, and I started building terrain for them. I even built a small version of the Minas Tirith front gates, and while I don't have that anymore, I do have this. This is a whole bunch of Gondor-themed terrain that I made when I was first getting into the hobby, and honestly, while it is pretty rough by today's standards, I can see the hint of what was to come with the way I do my terrain now. Unsurprisingly then, when another channel here on YouTube started to build a scale model version of Minas Tirith for Middle-earth strategy battle game, I was pretty hooked. And when I saw the collaboration that he did with a whole bunch of other YouTubers, yeah, I kind of really wanted in. And so when I was actually invited to participate in the next round of the build, I was blown away. And by invited, I mean I asked. Whatever, I don't care. No shame. If for some reason you haven't heard of this project, let me explain. As part of a community building project at the beginning of the pandemic, Blocky of the channel ZORPAZORP decided to build with his community a scale model version of Minas Tirith that they could eventually play a huge campaign on. This project has also evolved and expanded over the years, and it's just been a really cool one to follow, and now I get to actually put something of mine into it. Basically, I am going to be building my own Gondor building, which I am then sending down to Australia to be built into a new section of the board, along with a couple of other YouTubers. So with all that said, let's get into the project. Like all of my builds, I wanted to start with some kind of story for what this building is. Also, since it's going to be going towards such a big project, I really wanted to put something of myself into it. And so I really thought about what I wanted to see in a version of Minas Tirith. And one thing I've always thought was interesting when looking at movies like Lord of the Rings is thinking, where do people live in these places? Yeah, we see the palaces, the stables, the houses of healing, but we don't see just an average apartment building. Or for that sense, what about all the poor people in the city? Where do they live? And so an idea started to form in my mind there, and also a way to tie it into one of my other projects, namely my Arnor army. So this is what I came up with. As the war rages on in Arnor, more and more refugees flee the land and make their way south to Gondor where it's safe. But they had nowhere to go there. And so in order to help people who were fleeing the war up north, a shelter was built in Minas Tirith for refugees of the Arnorian War. This house helped people to make a new life for themselves here in a new land. And as the years went on and the war in Arnor ended, there were always still people who needed help. And so what was once a shelter for refugees has now become a place of refuge for the poor and homeless of Minas Tirith. A place of caring, a place of hope. And so with that plan down, let's get into the build itself. I started by sketching out a few versions of what I thought the building might look like, and I did have a few details I wanted to incorporate. I knew I wanted to have a big open balcony on the second floor, and below that a sheltered area with large serving windows where people could come to get food or sign in to sleep at the house for the night. On top of that, I decided I really wanted to make the interior accessible, as while that's not strictly necessary for this project, it's an aspect of wargaming buildings that I've always really liked and wanted to include in this. Once I was happy with the overall design, it was time to start the actual building process, and I once again turned to my favorite material, foam core. In order to do it in bulk, I just cut long strips of this that I would then cut down to the length I needed. And it was while I was doing this that I hit the first of the big hurdles of this project. Namely, I lost power. For a week. We had a huge storm up here in Ottawa, Canada that knocked out big sections of our power grid. This meant that I wasn't able to do any work in my basement as there was no light down there. And I ended up doing a whole lot of the initial prep for this project in my living room upstairs. Also, for anyone familiar with the storm, this will be the initial indication of just how long this project has taken, in that this storm happened way back in spring. We were also very fortunate to be well enough set up that we were able to pretty much manage this week without power. And it also was kind of fun to be able to work in an area other than my normal desk, as I was able to spend more time with my wife and even got her involved in the process a little bit. Mainly she helped me with the scoring of the bricks, as I use the same technique that Lockie does in his videos, cutting out the brick shapes with an X-Acto knife and then widening the gap with a pencil run along the seams. And then at night I even did a little bit of work by candlelight. One fun thing I did here was I actually mixed up the brick patterns between the different layers in order to give the whole building a little bit more variety, as if it had been built up in sections over a couple of years, as this kind of stuff, it would have taken time. And so by the time the power came back, I had all of the individual pieces I needed for the project already cut out, and I was able to jump right into assembly. As I said, I wanted this whole thing to have an accessible interior, and so I wanted to be able to remove each layer in order to get inside. And one way I made this work was by making each wall 2 layers thick with the sections of foam core offset. This meant that when one wall section was placed on top of the other, the overhang on the bottom went into the opening on the top of the other one. I don't know if I like that wording. I then based the whole thing on a sheet of MDF that I cut to shape. It was also here that I added the staircase I wanted from before by stacking layers of foam board one on top of the other and then smoothing it out with some drywall compound. For the rounded wall themselves, I did this simply by gluing and bending one layer of styrofoam to shape before adding the second inside of it. I then finished it off by cutting a styrofoam ball into quarters and sticking that on top. Second floor is also where I wanted the aforementioned balcony, so I cut a second piece of MDF and attached that on the front with a couple of pillars made of dowels to hold it up, which I glued and screwed into place. The staircase to the third floor was far simpler, as I just cut and glued in the side shapes before adding each individual step on top of it. With the bulk of the build already done, I then started adding details with things like extra bricks around doorways, lines of bricks between the levels, bits of egg carton onto the corners to hide the edges, bigger bricks on top to get that stepped look for the roof, and finally this little addition onto the side of the second floor, which I built separately and then glued on, cutting out the excess wall and building a little stairway up. This is for, well, historical accuracy, as an element of medieval architecture that frequently goes underrepresented. Lastly, I added texture to the MDF sections by laying down a bunch of individual bricks I cut out of egg cartons with PVA before pouring sand over top of this, brushing off the excess and locking the rest down by soaking it with isopropyl alcohol and watered down PVA glue. And with that sorted out, it was onto the roof, and for this we moved on to a new material: cereal boxes. I used this to make the shingles by drawing out a big grid and then cutting strips of shingles by cutting out each individual one with an X-Acto knife and then expanding the gaps with a pen before gluing the strips down onto panels of normal cardboard. This actually worked out really well and was relatively efficient, as shingles can frequently be a real pain to sort out. But it does make a real mess of whatever cutting mat you have underneath it. Once I had 2 panels of these, I finished it up by attaching them together with some triangles of foam core. And with that all sorted, it was looking good. However, I did notice that the bottom panel had warped a bit. However, I did have an idea of how to sort this out using the same technique as I used in my Mirkwood tree video. Basically, I run a bead of construction adhesive around the edge of the base before pressing it down onto some parchment paper and smoothing it all out to give a nice bevel. Once this had dried, I peeled the whole thing off the parchment paper, cut off any excess, and then added the same sand textured onto the adhesive to blend it into the rest of the piece. And with that, the build was finished, but before moving on to the painting, there was a few extra little details we needed to do. I said I wanted this building to have originally been a haven for Arnorian refugees and wanted to bring that style into it somehow. And I decided it on a statue. I like to think that this was completed near the end of the war, but not quite at its finale, and so presumably this was during the rule of King Aerophant. I actually made a version of King Aerophant for my Arnor army, and so I got the same model I used for that, attached it to a couple of extra bases I have to make a bit of a plinth, and then dry brushed the whole thing with successive layers of gray and white in order to make it look like a nice stone statue. But that was a long time ago, and now at the time of the War of the Ring, this building was a shelter for the poor and homeless of Minas Tirith. And so one thing it really needed was beds. And so I decided to make a bunch of bunk beds, and I went about it pretty simply by basically sandwiching a couple of pieces of foam between 4 lengths of square dowel before adding blankets over top, which I created by laying a little bit of tissue paper over the foam before soaking it with isopropyl alcohol and PVA glue to firm it up. I was actually really happy with how this initial one turned out, so I proceeded to make another 10 of them. This meant that I actually had enough beds for every one of my patrons, but we'll get back to that later. First, we had to give them a quick paint job, which I did by simply adding a thin layer of brown to all of the wood and then painting all of the fabric in a off-white. But I wanted to add a little bit of variety to these as well, and so I watered down a whole bunch of different craft paint colors and then lightly applied this to the bedding. Once all the paint was dry, I then took a fine tip pen and added the initials of every single one of my patrons onto the ends of each of these beds. I know this is silly, but it just felt like one way I was able to communicate even just a little bit of how much your contribution means to me. Honestly, it's been a pretty wild time lately, but having the support and knowledge that all of you are still there means a ton to me. In particular, I want to give a big thank you to our newest patron, Tomas, as it's amazing to have you along with the team. And if any of you out there are interested in getting involved with our little community, hop over onto the page and take a look. However, if you're not up for that kind of commitment but still want to show some kind of support for the show, I actually have a Buy Me a Coffee page up now where you can just make a one-time little contribution. I even have a wish list up there of all these individual things that I would like to have for future projects, so if you wanted to grab one of those from the list, that would be amazing too. One thing I actually had on the list was the female Frostgrave Warriors, which was kindly fulfilled by Pesci. So that's going to be pretty cool to do some projects with soon. That's enough of that for now though, as I'm starting to feel a little bit sappy here, and so let's move on with the painting of this project. Starting off, I mixed a primer layer using Mod Podge and craft paint to get a nice bluey mid-gray tone, and slap that over the whole thing. After laying down 2 coats of this to get a good finish, I hit the whole thing with a heavy overbrush of off-white. And by overbrush, I really just mean a really heavy and messy dry brush. Going so heavy meant that the whole thing quickly started to read as off-white, but still retained some depth from the undercoat. While I mostly use this for the brickwork, I used the same thing for the tiles on the balcony and the main floor, but went way lighter here to maintain some differentiation. The same thing went for the tiles, but here I went even lighter, just doing enough to catch the raised details. Next, we wanted to add some variety to the bricks, so I got a selection of craft paints out and thinned them down heavily before applying these sporadically around the whole building. This is always one of my favorite steps, as it really starts to bring the whole thing to life, but also makes it pretty garish looking. But to bring it all back together, I took out some pure white and dry brushed the whole thing again. I honestly went a bit heavier here than I initially wanted, but even with that, you can still make out some of those colors nice and subtly under the white. Once that had fully dried, I mixed up a nice black wash, which I added over the entire structure to bring back some of that texture we had lost. To keep the whole thing from turning too monotone, I mixed up a heavy brown wash and applied this pretty aggressively around the bottom of the building to just make the whole thing look more dirty and realistic. I also spent way too long adding more brown to a certain section.
Michael, are you okay? Did you throw up in there?
Oh, I'm just pooping. You know how I be.
But it smells like throw up in here.
Crazy world, a lot of smells.
Before adding random streaks scattered around the piece and applying one final light dry brush to clean it all up. Finally, there were just a few finishing touches I wanted to do. To give the building a bit more life, I decided to add a bit of greenery to it by applying some Mod Podge into the odd nook and pressing some flock into that. I even added a selection of tufts and flowers to the base, including some purple ones to once again tie it into my Arnor army. Speaking of Arnor, since this was originally built to house Arnorian refugees, I decided to make a couple of quick Arthedanian banners and added them to the front of the building. I felt these tied in really nicely to the standard black and white of Gondor, but still brought in that Arthedanian look I wanted with the star. Then, to add a bit more detail to the windows, I sprayed some of this plastic granny grating I found at the dollar store black and dry brushed it with silver before cutting it to shape and gluing it into place with some super glue. Finally, I added in the beds from before, glued in the statue of King Araphant, and brought in these two models which I painted up to be the hosts and owners of the building. These are a couple of models that were made by a local Canadian company, Westphalia Miniatures, and while I think they're technically based off of Tiger King, I've never watched that show and have no interest in it, so I don't really know what to call them. But if you have any good ideas, post them in the comments below, as I'd love to know what to name them. And there we are, the building is finished, and all I need to do now is stick the whole thing into a box and mail it halfway around the world to be built into the final board. It feels pretty amazing to have been able to be part of such a big project, and kind of an honor, as this thing is really turning into a pretty unique part of wargaming history. This project has honestly been pretty wild, and as I mentioned before, has actually spanned almost the entire year, so just looking back on where I was when it started is pretty wild. The channel was just over 5,000 subscribers when now it's well over 7. I've started 4 new armies since then, and most of all, my wife was pregnant at the beginning of this, and now we have a child. Frickin' wild. So thank you so much for coming along this journey with me, and be sure to check out Lockie's video of the big build, as well as any other videos that the other contributors have made for their own parts of this project. I also have a whole bunch of ideas for potentially really cool projects coming up, so be sure to subscribe here on YouTube so you don't miss those, and follow me on Instagram so you can keep up with anything I'm doing. But for now, just thanks for hanging out, and stay safe, everybody. Perfect. I'm gonna put that in.